Welcome to the latest edition of the OmniTalk Spotlight Series, the series that highlights the people, the companies, and the technologies that are shaping the future of retail. I'm one of your co-hosts for today's interview, Chris Walton.
And I'm Ann Mazinga.
And one of the topics that has been finally finding its way into our content rotation is sustainability. Hallelujah, right, Ann?
Absolutely. Yes, it's about time. It's about
I know,
damn
and
time, as Lizzo would say.
It's about damn time. Yeah, it is. It really is. And it really is starting to make its way into our content stream on a regular basis, particularly ever since we went to Shop Talk Europe here a few months ago. And so we asked two experts from our go-to supply chain automation company, Dematic, to come onto this podcast series to get practical about how retailers can make their supply chains more sustainable. At the conclusion of this podcast, we hope you will leave more knowledgeable about the real actions you can take that just might make a difference. So it is with great pleasure that we introduce today's guests, Dematic's Market Development Director, Danielle Dakin, and Dematic's Global Sustainability Director, DeAnn Hargis. Danielle and DeAnn, welcome to OmniTalk.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Ann.
Hello.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for inviting us.
It's great to have you.
You know what? I've been looking forward to this, so let's go.
All right. I love that attitude. Yeah, let's get to it. Love it.
Well, let's start by having each of you kind of tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and your roles at Dematic. And Danielle, we'll start with you first.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I guess I feel a bit like a logistics veteran because I've worked in the industry since I graduated university, which is now, about 22 years ago.
Wow. Yeah.
And I went from working on the shop floor, picking as a graduate trainee, to spending most of my career in the realm of warehouse process improvements. And, in that time, I worked across a number of industries with organizations that you'd recognize, like Tesco, which is the UK supermarket, and Coca-Cola, which is a really well-known global brand. And I'd worked
slightly. Yeah, slightly. I'd say slightly.
Sorry?
I think I've heard of Coke. Yeah, I think so.
You have. Well, with those organizations, I'd work with teams to identify challenges and look for opportunities to make processes better. But today, I work at Dematic as a market development director, as you said, which is really a subject matter expert in the grocery market. And I know it sounds like a big title, and a big remit, but what it really means is that I spend a lot of time understanding what's happening in the grocery retail market and just getting to know things like challenges, key trends impacting the market so that we can help our customers overcome challenges, really.
Danielle, is your background is your role, is it global or is it confined to the Europe or the UK market?
No, it's global. So we
It
look
is.
at North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Yeah. So it's quite fascinating, especially when you play in different cultures as well.
Yeah, it's a great perspective when you're looking at grocery as an industry globally. That's a whole new angle to this conversation.
Well, and DeAnn, I'd love to have you give us a little bit of your background too, because I'm sure that with Danielle covering things globally, especially new trends, and not that it should be a trend, but sustainability is definitely something that Europe has been far, far ahead of us in the US prior to these last couple of years, it becoming more important. So tell us a little bit about how you focus on sustainability specifically in your role.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just kind of stepping back, I've had an amazing career, right? So I started in the high-tech industry of telecommunication networking equipment. So with a manufacturer and a builder of the telecom equipment. I've got a computer science and a business liberal arts degree. So my background just goes from end to end. But over the years, I've done everything from ERP and system implementations and transformations. I've run North America procurement after our competitor acquired the company. I ran a 40,000 square foot warehouse, very manual warehouse at that. I even sold less than load trucking services. So
wow.
When I say I have had a diverse background, I really have. But I found my passion area about 15 years ago when the chief purchasing officer came and asked me to build a supplier sustainability program. And the cool thing about that was that he was so personally committed to it that he was assigning people and resources to it. But what I enjoyed, it ultimately led me to sitting with 16 of the largest telecom providers globally to sit down and say, what's really important from a sustainability standpoint in our supply chain. And I even got out and did supply chain audits in our Chinese suppliers that we were outsourcing to China back at that time. And so it was really important what those suppliers were actually doing for their people, their operations, safety, you name it. So I've been at the two extremes of what sustainability can be.
Well, DeAnn, so you have a computer science degree and a liberal arts degree as well. That you are literally a needle in a stack of needles, my friend.
I like to say that, but you know what? I joined Dematic about 2 years ago as the director of global sustainability, and you know what? It's just exciting to see the supply chain industry start to grab a hold of sustainability and what it could mean.
All right, DeAnn. So let's start off with this. Now that we got your backgrounds out of the way, can you give us a little history lesson into sustainability and how companies have approached it vis-a-vis their supply chains over these past, however long you want to go back in history?
Yeah. So Chris, you know what? It's really hard to believe, but sustainability has been around nearly 50 years. People are just can't believe that, but historians point to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that came out in 1977 as the very beginning of the sustainability movement. And then, you know what, from 1997 to about 2007, or 1977 to 2007, about 30 years,
Wow.
it was moving quite slowly. And then since 2007, it has just gone to the forefront of government regulations, business to business conversations, and it has really changed the conversation in some of the demographics, more so in Europe than in the US. But let's be honest, the economy today is so intertwined. Very few companies just work in the US or just work in Europe. Everybody's starting to trade across the borders. And so it's really interesting to see how the governments and regulations are changing it. But, there's been a lot done. Everybody wants to talk about the 2015 Paris Accords. But I think you've told me that this is largely a US type of podcast. So let's focus in the North America and US. And all conversations these days are about the new regulations coming out from the Security and Exchange Commissions back March 6th. And simply put, what those regulations are going to require is that all publicly traded companies on any of the U.S. exchange, whether you're a U.S. company or a non-U.S. company but traded on the U.S. exchange, to disclose material climate risk. So basically that means, hey, is there a risk of extreme weather events or change in agricultural yields or water insecurity that could materially impact your business? And then what's the potential impact on the business, both financially and operationally? What's not said is, but we all know, if you see a risk and you pronounce there's a risk, you also have to take actions to mitigate that risk. And so with that, companies in the US are going to have to start looking a little bit broader than they have on sustainability. And you know what? I'd like to be really pragmatic about it, right? Not just sustainability, But if you don't like that word, let's talk about efficiencies and pragmatic business, right? You would never locate your warehouse in a flood zone, right?
Right.
But flood zones today are different than where they were if your warehouse was settled some 25 years ago, right? If you're in the produce or dealing with foods, you've got to worry about whether your suppliers, your produce suppliers, have the right kind of weather and temperature so that they can continue to produce at that rate. Those are the type of elements that companies are having to think about as, are they a risk to our future business?
So with all those new regulations coming in, has that impacted anything else, in regards to this conversation too, like any other constituencies? Like how are the banks looking at this in terms of, how they're financing a lot of these retailers and CPG companies? Are they putting sustainability into their covenants?
Absolutely. So what's exciting is that in 2021, so in the midst of COVID, the global banking institutions got together and they created this thing called the Net Zero Banking Alliance. It started with 44 banks. 3 years later, right, over the last 3 years, there's now 144 banks in 44 countries that have publicly committed to green their lending portfolios, right? So what this means are debt covenants and are being evaluated based on sustainability criteria. If your request for financing includes sustainability terms and includes a view that this is not a short term, a short investment, but it's really looking at the long haul, you should receive better approval ratings, potentially better interest rates, better terms and conditions. So it's really becoming much more holistic and connected in with the financing than just in the operations.
Got it. So net, the incentives are also starting to align here over the last 3 years, particularly to get companies focused on this effort. I'm curious too, Danielle, I want to bring you into this conversation, see if there's any color that you have to add as well. And one particular thing I found interesting too was that I don't know if you want to touch on this, or we'll go back to DeAnn for it as well. Is it seems you mentioned the CPGs being, kind of multinational more so than the retailers, and them taking kind of the lead on sustainability for the industry. Is that true? And what other color do you have to add, Danielle?
It's interesting to consider sustainability with a more kind of, I'd say, an inside-outside approach. So thinking about, your infrastructure that you've got, but also within buildings, facilities that you've got as well. And not only is that a sensible thing to do, it's really a logical thing to do, because there are going to be so many factors outside of many facilities that a lot of companies that have got that can influence the inside. So, for instance, before making, massive investments or commitments, down the sustainability route, you need to think about, lots of things really, but you need to review your infrastructure and how it supports the direction of travel for your business. So perhaps I can give you an example that just explains it a little bit better.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, I mean, I look after the grocery industry for Dematic. So let's say you're a grocer and you decide strategically that for your online orders, you're going to fulfill all of them in 24 hours. Okay. And then to meet this commitment for your customers, from a distribution infrastructure perspective, you'd need something like a localized hub and spoke model for distribution, meaning that your stock's going to have to be that bit closer to your end consumer or the customer. And let's say if you decided to go with a 2-hour commitment, well, that's going to have to change to something a bit more ultra local, maybe even automation within a store. So it's really important to ensure that that outside perspective can meet your overall strategic needs as well. So I just say, think about that when you're thinking about your overall sustainability strategy. Think about the bigger strategic angle that you're looking at too.
Well, and Danielle, how do CPGs and retailers, like as they're thinking about the things that you're talking about, which are getting close to the customer and really having the flexibility to say, are we going to do 24 hours? Are we going to do 2 hours? Like, is there something that they should be really thinking about when they're considering the large capital investments that it requires to build these centers in the first place, and then to build them flexibly, potentially to accommodate these changes that customers might expect in delivery times? Is there any advice that you'd share?
Yeah, definitely. And I think they fall into two categories really.
Okay.
So the first I've kind of already alluded to, which is, reviewing existing and newly planned infrastructure, let's say, because, well, an interesting example is like Nestle in the US, they began planning a manufacturing facility, and then they realized that actually the existing distribution infrastructure wouldn't be able to support it. And so they decided to build a warehouse attached to the manufacturing plant, which actually lightly reduced, that transportation carbon footprint and the fuel cost, because they didn't have to go as far because the facility was right next door. So, it's a really important thing to think about, is this infrastructure of your whole distribution. And then second, I think about planning to generate efficiencies within the distribution centers themselves.
Okay.
Meaning, ways to reduce waste and save money. And who doesn't want that at the end of the day?
Yeah.
And I guess a key area for cost reduction, particularly in grocery retail, is reducing food waste or shrinkage. And that's a big part of driving sustainability inside a warehouse. Software can be used to manage inventory, the use by dates, and to make sure that you've got stock that's fresh for onward delivery to stores. But I mean, that's not always possible to do that, and stock does go off. Grocers like Albert Heijn, they've been using software to monitor dates, and it means that they can actually push those products that are close to the end of their life at a reduced price to customers. So it really adds to that whole sustainability piece.
And how do you, oh, go ahead, DeAnn, jump in.
No, I was just agreeing that, you know what, there's so many people want to think of sustainability as, trees and plants and everything, but sustainability and efficiency go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Right? It's the new way of thinking about things that really makes a difference.
Well, and talk to me a little bit too about like how you put that down on paper, DeAnn, or Danielle, whoever wants to take this one. Just I'm hopeful that we can have the audience really get an understanding of like, how do you make the business case for this when you are investing in those new distribution centers? Like, what are the types of things that can go on the line items that are like, okay, this is reducing costs, or this is improving efficiency and meeting sustainability goals?
Yeah, you know what, Danielle started with this outside and inside standpoint, and I really like that perspective. When you're talking outside, right? If you're building a new distribution center, why not go ahead and plan a solar array, whether it's on the top of the building? And if you plan it at the beginning, then your roof and the structure can handle the additional weight. But you have a solar array that can offset so much of the energy demand that you're going to need for the cooling and all the automation, et cetera. You can really look at the community around and say, hey, is there an avenue so that I can get rainwater retention and everything? And how does that feed back into the community? That has the rainwater retention has a limited ROI, unless all of a sudden, what you don't understand, by building this massive distribution center, all of a sudden you've created flooding for the communities downstream, right? So you really have to step back and look differently. Inside, there's so much to do with automation and the technology, which is really Danielle's expertise. But there's how much natural lighting can you get, right? So that you don't have to run lights, even if they're LED lights. How do you get the most efficient HVAC or regenerative energy sources in there? So inside and outside is a great way to kind of think about what can we do, and they have different ROI factors.
Right.
So Danielle, let's talk about those a little bit. DeAnn just said you're the expert on the inside approach to, the existing centers. What are some of those things that you can do, particularly for the older distribution centers, to get them up to grade from a sustainability standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's lots that you can do. And I think, we have to face the reality that, logistics operations do cost money. They are an on-cost to any business, to run them and to run them well, even,
Right.
But I mean, the good news is that you don't have to go all big bang. You can take incremental steps to make improvements towards sustainable operations that also deliver savings, which is great news. But perhaps maybe I can give you, let's say, maybe 3 scenarios that relate to the big challenges in grocery retail distribution, because I think it will make it maybe a bit more meaningful and practical, actually. So sit back and relax for a moment.
Okay. Yes.
So firstly, as a business grows, often stock builds up, right, which requires warehousing space. So how do you magically create more space with what you've already got? Okay, that's the conundrum. So, doing things like operating in a reduced footprint area, it can really help support future growth for the retail and grocery industry, really. And it can be achieved through things like automated high density storage or pallet shuttles, or even auto store systems for e-commerce, for example. There's so many options depending on what you need in terms of throughput speed, the volumes that you've got, and the number of items that you need to store. So there's lots of possibilities there. But ultimately, automation can improve that capacity in the footprint that you've got, and give you those reduced operating costs that actually potentially impact profitability, which is a big challenge in the grocery industry, especially with margins. Now, the second scenario that I'll give you is that, well, most grocery operations find that transport costs are increasing. Year on year, they're going up. And to reduce costs, operators are looking at things like electric vehicles, alternative fuels. But actually, many Dematic customers have been implementing automated mixed case palletizing, which is basically, it's a system that efficiently stacks cases onto pallets that will then go onto stores to replenish the stock. And because the pallet is stacked so efficiently with more products, the number of pallets being shipped to store is actually less, which means better vehicle utilization. And I mean, over a year, it can really impact carbon footprint. So, that's a real win, especially when the cost of transportation is going up.
So
And then
basically the first two are
Yeah.
just basic blocking and tackling of good business then, really, at the end of the day. I mean, that's
Yeah,
what you're talking
absolutely.
about. So, all right,
Yeah.
I'm very relaxed now too, Danielle, I must say. So if you're going to give me a third one, I might need a cigarette afterwards. But yeah, go ahead. What's number 3?
Let me give you the third one because it is a big one. And I think a lot of
Okay.
people will relate to it as well, because it's the biggest cost process within a warehousing operation. And that is actually picking the order itself. But whilst it could be quite painful, it is an actual opportunity because it's the biggest variable cost within a warehouse. And that means you can actually do something about it, unlike, let's say, fixed building costs that you really can't do anything with until the term ends, for example. And again, here you can make incremental changes to improve picking efficiencies. If you're currently paper-based, you can move to a warehouse management system that captures things like the product date codes to reduce that food waste. You can go to something kind of semi-automated like a pick to light system that just helps reduce picking errors because it guides you where to pick, or you can actually go for big bang automation, like pallet storage and mixed case fulfillment that I've already talked about. There's something out there for everyone's budget. It's just knowing what the challenges are and where to begin.
Well, and I'd love for each of you to kind of go into one of the best ways to kind of share some of the things that you were just talking about, Danielle, is to give some examples of companies that Dematic has worked with to really kind of illustrate each of those three things that you called out, Danielle. DeAnn, I wonder if we can start with you first. Like, are there examples of how a company that you've worked with that's really taken a more sustainable approach with success that you can share?
Yeah, you know what? I want to point to one of our customers in Canada, Groupe Robert. And so Groupe Robert is the first 3PL provider in Quebec with an automated warehouse for both fresh and frozen foods. And it's split half of fresh food and half frozen, right? So it's fully automated. When they were building this distribution center, they implemented solar panels. So a lot of the energy demand is offset or provided naturally. So that lowers the overall operating expense immediately from day one, right? They're doing rainwater retention. So because they're taking up so much space, wanting to be a good neighbor and reusing that water. The other really cool thing, they're up in Quebec, so very cold winters. So they have taken the heat generated by the refrigeration equipment to actually warm the distribution center, and they're using it to melt the snow on the sidewalks coming and going. So you got health and safety, you've got, renewable energy or free energy for source, and you've got some free heat for the distribution center. That just makes, it makes a lot of logical sense, and it's incredibly sustainable. They've also really started focusing they're a 3PL, so they have a large trucking side of it. And so they have very efficient truck routing, looking at the travel times. They do pallet and crate recycling. So it's not brainiacs looking at how do I get the last little penny here and there. It's, the operational people saying, how do we do this smart?
Yes. Yeah. And I love it. It's still getting back to what you were saying earlier. Like, sustainable does mean more efficient. Like it just, there's all these ways, these things that keep coming and you don't know until you start trying it. Danielle, I'm going to you. I want an example from you too. What company can you call out that you've worked with that's really kind of taken these steps to really enhance efficiency and improve how their operations and their distribution centers are operating?
Yeah, sure. I can probably actually give you an outside and an inside example.
Okay.
I love it. That's perfect.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've all heard of the discounter Aldi, I'm guessing.
Yes.
So, I mean,
100%.
they've got about 2,000 stores and I think about 48 distribution centers. And actually, most of those are fitted with solar panels. So that's a great example of what's being done on the outside. And then on the inside, we've got Tesco, who's a UK supermarket in Europe. And they've actually taken a more inside approach. I'm sure they're doing a lot on the outside too. But specifically, they've looked at improving warehouse capacity in their fulfillment centers with automated shuttle technology. And the system that they put in actually meant that they could hold more variety of products, but also fulfill orders faster. So that really sung to what they were trying to do from a strategic point of view that I talked about earlier, and getting your infrastructure right.
Yeah.
But they also, just to step things up even another level, they adopted what's called micro fulfillment, and they've put those in about 9 of their supermarket stores. So this is like an automated system that will fulfill the online orders quickly. I mean, quite often we'll see people walking around supermarkets and picking those online orders. Well, this is all happening automatically behind the scenes, which is fantastic.
right? So micro fulfillment, which our OmniTalk fans know we have talked
Oh, yes.
ad nauseum about over the last 7 to 8 years, is also potentially a sustainability tactic that you're calling out Tesco for too, Danielle. That's great. All right, so let's close things up here. Let's get you out of here with this question. So I'm curious, we've had a long discussion, DeAnn. We started with the history of sustainability from the retail and consumer goods industry. What is one piece of advice you'd have for the average chief supply chain officer, or even the average supply chain executive listening to this podcast, to make his or her operation more sustainable?
So my view and what I believe it wholeheartedly, and it is the trend of what I'm seeing across major supply chain, a number of our customers, it's collaboration. You can't do this alone, right? And if you're really focused only internally on your company, you'll optimize yourself. But I don't know that that's really supporting what your customers need from you from a sustainability standpoint. And you definitely need your suppliers in there. So I think the key thing that I would recommend is think beyond just your own operations. Think of your customers and engage your customers in how you could help them be more sustainable. And then also engage your suppliers to say, look, how can you deliver more sustainable content to me?
And so if I'm listening to you right now, how would I go about doing that? If I'm a supply chain executive, how would you recommend that I do that? What are the action steps I could take to do what you just said?
So, you definitely want to talk with your salespeople and your marketing people about trends that they're seeing in the customer set, right? And then what are the 2, 3, you don't need all of them. You need 2 or 3 leaders in sustainability on their side to give you some really direct feedback. If you did X, or if you could deliver to me in this kind of standpoint, and that's going to give them some outside, customer feedback on how they could be more sustainable. And then you also have to turn it around and say, what are my suppliers doing? Am I getting an excess amount of, cardboard boxes? Is there something we can do different in how my supplier is providing goods to me? To then I can eliminate that much amount of my waste. You can see a straight line through from what the customer is expecting, your operation, which then drives the supplier to understand what you need to ask of the suppliers.
All right. Well, Danielle, close us out. What's the one piece of advice you would give to the average supply chain executive?
So I'd say, whether you've got an existing infrastructure or you're planning a new one or changes, I'd say absolutely review that to ensure that it matches how you're going to meet the needs of your customer and what they need. That strategic fit, will it meet those commitments that you're going to make promises to? But also don't stop there with the review. Plan for the next 10 years to make incremental improvements. Even if it's a new build warehouse, even if it's an existing warehouse, keep those plans moving to add in sustainable processes, but also the necessary automation to support it.
That's an interesting point too. And DeAnn, I want to bring you back into this too, because we started with the history lesson. I was a history major in college. You brought up your specialty in college. Might as well bring mine up too. We've talked about some of these goals going into covenants already or being codified. How much more should we expect the goal to increase, over the next 10 or 15 years as you're trying to plan out? Because I imagine the goal today is going to be very different from the goal tomorrow. Is that a correct assumption to end on here?
Absolutely. And you know what? If you look at regulations, governmental regulations, they're only increasing, right? I sit in Georgia, and I noticed your coffee cup was from a California school, right?
Yeah.
You know what? If you're doing business in California, you are already seeing those regulations and the year-on-year increase on expectations for you. Other regions of the US, a little less, but it's coming, right? And for any company in the US that really wants to do business on a global scale, not only is sustainability an efficiency factor for your operations, it also becomes a requirement of doing business with many companies.
Right. Just like it was for California, you know, it is for California for a lot of manufacturers too. Like you have to plan for that. Like let's just start planning for your international requirements and then eventually
Yeah.
they'll come here. Well, thank you so much to both of you, DeAnn and Danielle. It was so insightful. Thank you for sharing your advice and these examples with our audience today. If people want to get in touch with you to learn more about Dematic and specifically each of your areas of expertise, what is the best way for them to get in touch with each of you? And DeAnn, I'll start with you.
Okay. I think the simplest one is just to send an email, and we'll use the sustainability@dematic.com. And that's a inbox that I manage in addition to my personal one. So it's easy to remember.
That's cool. I've never
Excellent.
seen that before. That's awesome. That's really cool that you guys do that.
All right, Danielle, where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy for people to reach out to me directly. So if they want to email me, I'm danielle.dakin@dematic.com.
And Dakin is spelled
Dakin.
That wraps us up today. Thanks again to both Danielle and DeAnn for sitting down with us and for everyone out there listening in. And as always, on behalf of all of us here at OmniTalk, be careful out there.